Hello everybody and welcome to Document and Handwriting Analysis. Document and Handwriting Analysis is probably one of my most favorite units because it can tell you so much. Just from a person's handwriting you can tell their personality. You can tell their traits and their habits. You can profile a person really well. During the time, you're going to have question documents, and then you have the control documents, where you'll ask a person to recreate words and letterings without making them recreate the exact same thing. So question documents will involve examining the handwriting, the ink, the paper, everything to determine where it came from. It could be a letter, it could be a check, it can be a passport, wills, contracts, any of that. The investigations will include just authenticating it. So if a person, let's say, altered their will and then they died the next day, they will actually go through and look at that will to make sure that it was actually signed by the person and not forged by a family member that might be getting money in the deal. Some of the related fields. Oops. Let's go back. Some of the related fields. You can have historical dating, which deals with art examination, verifying the age of an actual document or an object. You see this a lot in art. Fraud investigation, where money is the main intent. So wills, contracts, insurance is a big one. Paper and ink specialists will actually look at the paper itself to see if the paper comes from the time. So it goes a lot into historical dating as well. Those go hand in hand. Forgery specialists, which will look to see if autographs or signatures are the same and by the correct person. That's why now we have a lot of times when you get signed like baseballs and that stuff, they'll actually put an authenticating sticker on it to make you realize that it's verified that it's signed by the correct person. Typewriting analysts are actually going by the wayside. You don't see typewriters as often, few and far between. It's kind of the hipster thing to do now. But you still have them. You just don't see them as much. And then computer crime investigators, which we'll get into in the next lecture. The document examination itself involves the analysis of all of the documents. So the handwriting, the ink, the person that wrote it. You want to try and see how much you can tell from that person. So handwriting will involve two phases. The first phase is the hardware itself. So the ink, the paper, the pens, the pencils, the printers. As you're writing stuff, you'll notice, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've noticed this, that sometimes when you're writing with one kind of pen, your handwriting will look one way, but if you switch to a pencil or a different brand of pen, the handwriting might come out a little bit different. So, and then the second part is the visual examination of the writing itself. So, there are 12 characteristics to handwriting. Line quality, which tells you how, straight of a line the person writes on, if there's any wavering or anything like that. Word and letter spacing, so making sure that it's the same spacing between each of the words and the letters. There's not giant gaps in between certain words. Letter comparison, so all the A's look the same, all the B's look the same. Pen lifts are where you lift the pen after a word. Connecting strokes are where you connect letters together or words together. Beginning and ending strokes, so how you start your letters and how you end your letters. Unusual letter formation. So I have a friend that would quite literally write a cursive G, but her cursive G looked like a typewriter, okay? So it would have a circle at the top, then down, and then a little squiggly, and a dot or a line in there at the top. So her letter formation, I know exactly because I have a G in my address and my my name. I know exactly where that letter comes from if it's got her G on it. Shading and pin pressure, so how hard you press. I've had people turn in papers where you can actually read the paper from the backside by using your hand because it's pressed in so hard. The slant of it, so if they have a back slant or a forward slant, and then if they have unusual slanting letters. Flourishes or embellishments are all the fancy swoopty-whoopty-woos that you add in. And then diacritic placement is where you dot your I's or cross your T's or dot your lowercase j's. So when you go into handwriting identification, you have to analyze the known writing with a determination of the characteristics found in the known. So you look at those 12 characteristics and you determine how many of them are unique or what each one is. Okay. Then you start looking at unknown writing samples and determine their characteristics. And then you compare the two together. Okay. So, the evaluation of the evidence, you look at the similarities and the dissimilarities between the question and the known. There's no exact number that you have to have between to make a match. But it has to go with the document examiner's, credibility and their vouching for it. So, the subject should not be shown the question document. You're not going to say, hey, can you write this ransom note for me? You are going to actually give them other stuff that has words from it, specific words, especially if there's words that are misspelled or they use weird punctuation in it. You'll ask them to write it again, but you don't let them see how it's spelled. You're going to verbally say, I need you to write this stuff down. You know, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, for instance. The subject should use materials similar to those of the document, so the pen and the paper should be of similar characteristics. And the dictated text, so the part that the officer will read to the person, may have some parts of the document. So some words that are the same, some phrasing that is the same, but it's not in the same format. And then at the very end, the subject has to sign the text and you have to have witnesses to the person writing it. So there's 3 methods of forgery. So simulated forgery is where you make it by looking at a genuine signature. So you look at John Doe's signature and then you sign it right next to it. Trace forgery is where you put your paper over the top of the original and then you trace over it. And then a blind forgery is just one that you make just by saying, okay, I think this is how John Doe would sign it. You've never seen the signature before, so you have nothing to compare to. So, types of forgery as it goes through, you have check fraud, paper money, counterfeiting, and identity and credit cards, which will go into the next chapter, which falls into cybercrimes. And then you have art, which is a huge one because a lot of people will say, oh, I found this Van Gogh painting in my wall when I was, tearing down this villa to remodel it. And they'll say, oh no, this is a real one, blah, blah, blah. And so you have to go through and you have to verify that it's an actual real one. And it's not something that they just copied and they're expecting to get a big payout from it. And you can do carbon dating, you can do electromagnetic radiation, you can look at it under a microscope to see if it's the same. And some of the paints at the time will have actual elements in it that are not used in paint today. So you'll be able to tell very quickly if it's a real piece of art or not. And then contracts, alterations of contracts, insurance contracts, wills, medical records, all sorts of stuff you can look at for forgery as well. When you have document alterations, that is where you have obliterations, which is where somebody will try to remove the physical writing by either physically removing it, like for instance with an eraser, or chemically with chemicals to remove it from the paper. So you can detect it using microscopic examination, UV or infrared light, and then digital imaging processing. Indentations you can use. So for instance, if somebody writes on a notepad, you can look at the papers underneath using oblique lighting or the ESDA, which is kind of like where you you put magnetic toner over the top, and then you draw over it with like a wand, and it'll stick to the indentations. A forensic linguist is a person that will actually look at the content of the question document to see if they can establish the writer's age and other qualities about the person. So this goes into profiling. Chromatography is where you actually separate the ink. So it includes two phases, a mobile one that flows past a stationary one. So the mobile one, which will be a liquid of some sort, or air or gas or anything like that. And then the stationary will be a piece of paper or plastic or glass. In our case, we're going to use ink and paper. So stationary phase is the paper. Mobile phase is the liquid that is moving through it. So water, acetone, stuff like that. And the capillary action, so as the water moves through the paper, it'll actually separate out the dyes within that ink. What we look at is something called the retention factor. So it's how far the sample moves divided by how far the solvent moves, okay? So solute divided by solvent equals the RF factor. And you can tell this because each ink or dye will have a different RF factor. Paper itself, there's tons of differences based on what it's made out of, how thick it is, the color, if there's watermarks, if it has glowing under black light. If it's old, it'll be really yellow because of UV light and damage to air and pollution. Pencils, lead, you have the hardness scale. So we typically go with a number 2, which is 2H hardness or 2B hardness. And then everything will be softer than that or harder than that. So if you ever use pencils that are like a 3 or a 4, you have to press really hard to get the paper or the pencil to show up on the paper. And then evidence. Handwriting is class characteristics, which will include the pens, the pencils, the paper. The individual characteristics will involve unique handwriting characteristics, so something that is different than other people. Trash marks from copiers, so where a line shows up or a smear. Or the printer serial numbers themselves, because sometimes when a printer prints paper, it'll actually embed a serial number in the corner of the paper that's invisible to the naked eye. And thank you for listening. Let me know if you have questions. Thanks. Bye.